The air in the makeshift auction hall was thick with the stench of cheap whiskey, unwashed bodies, and despair. It wasn't a hall at all, but the cavernous guts of a livery stable on the fringes of a town called Perdition's End. Jedediah had only come for a new draft horse, but the grim silence from this part of town had drawn him in, a morbid curiosity he now regretted. On a crude wooden platform stood a man with a greasy smile and a louder suit, his gavel held like a weapon. Next to him, head bowed and shoulders trembling, was a woman. Her wrists were bound in rusted iron shackles, the chain leading to a ring in the floorboards. Her dress was torn and filthy, a ghost of what might once have been a fine traveling gown. Dust and tears had carved pale tracks through the grime on her cheeks. The auctioneer, a man they called Silas, began his spiel. "Gentlemen, a rare opportunity. A piece of unclaimed property, found wandering and without a sponsor. Strong back, fine teeth, and a spirit that needs a firm hand to be broken." He yanked the chain, forcing a pained gasp from her. A few men in the sparse, shadowy crowd chuckled. Jedediah stood in the back, his face a mask of stone carved by sun and sorrow. He was a quiet man, a rancher who had buried his wife and daughter 5 years prior, and with them most of his words. His world had shrunk to the borders of his land, a silent kingdom of grief, but the sight before him stirred something dormant, an old, aching sense of duty. This was a profanity, a desecration of everything a man was supposed to stand for. He saw the flicker of defiance in the woman's eyes as she glanced up, a spark of wild light in the suffocating darkness, and it reminded him of the untamed hawk he'd once seen fight off a coyote. "Let's start the bidding at $20, Silas bellowed. "A bargain for a lifetime of service." A grimy prospector with yellowed teeth raised a finger. "20. I see 20. Do I hear 30? Another man, a corpulent saloon owner with a wet cigar clamped in his jaw, grunted. 30. Jedediah's hand clenched into a fist at his side. He wasn't a rich man. The drought had been hard, and his savings were meant for winter feed and a new bull. But the money in his pocket felt like burning coals. This wasn't about a purchase. It was about an intervention, an act of defiance against the cruelty that the world so easily accepted. 50. Jedediah's voice cut through the low murmurs. It was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together, but it carried the weight of the mountains that shadowed his ranch. Every head turned to look at the tall, solitary figure in the back. His face was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the woman. Silas's greasy smile widened. 50 from the quiet rancher, a man who knows value when he sees it. Do I hear 60? The saloon owner scowled, looking the woman up and down with a possessive sneer. 60? 70, Jedediah said instantly, his voice colder this time. He took a step forward, out of the deepest shadows. The saloon owner hesitated, then spat a stream of tobacco juice on the dirt floor. 80? 100? A collective gasp went through the room. It was an absurd price. More than a prime bull, more than a deed to a small claim. It was the price of a statement. The saloon owner threw his hands up in disgust and turned away. The prospector had already slunk back into the crowd. Silas's eyes gleamed with avarice. $100. A fine price for a fine piece of property. Going once, going twice. He waited, letting the tension hang in the air. Sold! The gavel cracked down like a gunshot. To the quiet man in the back. Jedediah walked forward, his boots making no sound on the dirt floor. He ignored the stares and the whispers. He ignored Silas, who was extending a greedy hand. He walked straight to the platform, his eyes only on the woman. He pulled out a worn leather purse and counted out the gold coins, the sound of them clinking on the wood a stark finality. Then he knelt. He produced a small, sturdy file from his coat pocket, the kind he used for sharpening tools. The woman flinched as he reached for her wrists, a tremor of pure terror running through her. He paused, his hands hovering over the cold iron. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time he spoke to her, his voice a low whisper that was meant only for her. I mean you no harm, he said, the words a solemn vow. You're safe now. The scrape of the file against the iron shackle was the only sound in the sudden silence of the livery stable. The crowd watched, a mixture of confusion and resentment on their faces. They had come for a spectacle of dominance, not one of quiet liberation. Jedediah worked with a steady, practiced hand, his focus absolute. He did not look at Silas, who was pocketing the coins with a scowl, nor at the other men who felt cheated of their cruel entertainment. He simply worked, his knuckles brushing against the woman's cold skin as he sawed through the first manacle. It fell to the wooden platform with a dull thud. He then moved to the other wrist, never breaking his rhythm. The woman, Ilara, watched him, her breath caught in her throat. She had been prepared for brutality, for a transfer from one monster to another. This silent, intense man was an enigma. His whisper had been a lifeline, but she dared not yet believe in it. The second shackle fell, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, her hands were her own. Jedediah rose to his full height and offered a hand to her. It was a large hand, calloused and scarred, the hand of a man who worked the earth. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then placed her small, trembling hand in his. He helped her to her feet, his touch firm but respectful. "My property now," Jedediah said, his voice now rising to a normal volume, directed at Silas and the room at large. The words were a legal claim, a shield. "I'll be taking her." Silas stepped forward, his bravado returning. "What you do with her is your business, rancher, but you'd be wise to remember where you got her. She has a debt." "The debt is paid," Jedediah stated, his gaze as cold and hard as granite. He turned his back on the man, a clear dismissal, and gently guided Ilara toward the wide stable doors. The crowd parted before them, their whispers following like rustling leaves. Outside, the harsh sunlight of Perdition's End was blinding. Jedediah led her to an old but sturdy buckboard wagon hitched to a single, powerful-looking horse. He helped her onto the seat without a word, his movements efficient and deliberate. He then untied the reins and climbed up beside her. The buckboard lurched forward, leaving the dark livery stable and its sordid business behind. The journey was a silent one. The town quickly gave way to the vast, unforgiving landscape of the West. Mesas painted in shades of rust and ochre stood sentinel against a piercingly blue sky. The silence in the wagon was different from the silence in the stable. It was not laden with threat, but with uncertainty. Ilara huddled on her side of the bench, clutching her freed hands in her lap, watching the stoic man beside her. He drove the horse with an easy confidence, his eyes scanning the horizon. He seemed as much a part of this rugged land as the rocks and the scrub brush. She studied his profile, the strong jaw, the lines of grief etched around his eyes, the mouth set in a permanent somber line. He had not looked at her once since they'd left the town. He had bought her, freed her, and now he was taking her. Where? The fear, which had receded, began to creep back in. What did he want from her? The price he paid was staggering. No man paid that much for a servant. As the sun began to dip low, casting long shadows across the trail, he finally pulled the wagon to a halt. He pointed ahead. "My ranch. Over that rise." Ilara looked and saw nothing but more rock and dust. He didn't wait for a reply. He climbed down, retrieved a canteen from the back of the wagon, and walked over to her side. "You should drink," he said. It wasn't a command, but a simple statement of fact. She took the canteen, her fingers brushing his. She drank deeply, the cool water a balm to her parched throat. When she was done, she handed it back, their eyes meeting for a brief, searching moment. "Well," she finally managed to ask, her voice a fragile rasp, "why did you do that?" Jedediah took the canteen and hung it back on the wagon. He stared out at the land, his land, as if the answer was written in the dust. "Because no person should be sold," he said, his voice low and final. "Now, we should keep moving. The night gets cold." The last light of day was painting the sky in strokes of deep orange and purple as the buckboard crested the final rise. Below them, nestled in a shallow valley carved by an ancient creek, was Jedediah's ranch. It was not a grand place. A simple, sturdy cabin of hewn logs stood beside a large, well-kept barn. A corral held a pair of horses that lifted their heads as the wagon approached. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney of the cabin. The entire place exuded an aura of profound solitude. Jedediah brought the wagon to a stop near the cabin's front porch. He climbed down and, without a word, came around to her side. Ilara, stiff from the long ride, accepted his offered hand and stepped onto the solid ground. The air here was cleaner, smelling of pine and dust and the promise of rain. "The house has 2 rooms, he said, his voice matter-of-fact as he began unhitching the horse. "The main room and a bedroom. The bedroom is yours." Ilara stood frozen, processing his words. "Mine?" He nodded, not looking at her. "I sleep by the hearth, have for years." He led the horse toward the barn. "There's a pump out back for water, stew on the stove inside. Help yourself." He disappeared into the shadows of the barn, leaving her alone on the patch of earth between the house and the setting sun. For a moment, she didn't move. She listened to the gentle sounds of the ranch, the nicker of a horse, the creak of a leather harness, the sigh of the wind through the tall grass. It was a symphony of peace, so alien to the terror she'd grown accustomed to. Tentatively, she climbed the 2 steps onto the porch and pushed open the cabin door. The inside was simple, clean, and unmistakably masculine. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, a well-worn armchair and a small cot arranged before it. A sturdy wooden table with 2 chairs sat in the center of the room. On a cast-iron stove in the corner, a pot of stew bubbled softly, filling the air with the savory scent of beef and vegetables. Through an open doorway, she could see the bedroom. It contained a simple bed with a patchwork quilt, a small wooden chest, and a washstand with a pitcher and bowl. It was sparse, but it was a sanctuary. She ladled some of the stew into a bowl and sat at the table, eating slowly. The warmth of the food spread through her, chasing away some of the deep, lingering chill. When Jedediah entered, he moved with a quiet efficiency, washing his hands in a basin by the door before serving himself. He sat opposite her at the table, and they ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable, but contemplative. After they had finished, he gestured toward the bedroom. "There are some clothes in the chest. They belong to my wife. They may not fit well, but they are clean." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, yet the words themselves were an act of profound intimacy and trust. Alara nodded, unable to form a reply. She retreated into the bedroom and gently opened the chest. Inside, folded neatly, were a few simple dresses of calico and wool. They smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. She ran her hand over the soft fabric, a wave of sorrow washing over her for the woman she would never know, the woman whose life had filled this silent house. She chose a simple blue dress and washed the grime of her ordeal from her face and hands in the basin when she emerged. Jedediah was stoking the fire, his back to her. "The door has a lock," he said, his eyes on the flames. "Use it. You have no reason to trust me yet." The statement hung in the air between them. He was not just offering her a room. He was acknowledging her fear, validating it. He was giving her power in a world that had stripped her of all of it. "What is your name?" she asked softly. He turned from the fire to look at her, truly look at her for the first time. In the flickering firelight, the hardness in his face seemed to soften. "Jedediah," he said. "I am Alara." "Alara," he repeated, testing the name. He gave a single, somber nod. "Get some rest. You are safe here." She retreated to the bedroom and closed the door. She heard the soft click of the latch as she turned the simple wooden lock. In the darkness, wrapped in a quilt that held the ghost of another woman's life, Alara listened to the sounds of the man in the other room settling onto his cot. For the first time in weeks, she was not in chains. She was not a piece of property. She was a person in a room with a locked door, and for tonight, that was enough. The next morning, Alara woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Sunlight streamed through the single window in the bedroom, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. The softness of the mattress, the weight of the quilt, the profound quiet. It was all a dream. Then the memories of the auction, the chains and the silent man flooded back. She was in the quiet man's house. She was in Jedediah's house. She dressed in the borrowed calico dress and unlocked the door. Jedediah was at the stove, his back to her. A plate of bacon and eggs sat on the table, waiting for her. He seemed to sense her presence, turning his head slightly. "Morning," he grunted, then turned back to his own plate. The routine they had established the night before continued. They ate in silence, yet today, the silence felt different. It was less about uncertainty and more about observation. She watched him, noting the way he held his coffee cup, the distant look in his eyes as he stared out the window. He was a man locked within himself. After the meal, he stood up. "I have work to do, mending a fence line on the north pasture. I'll be gone most of the day." He paused at the door, his hand on the latch. "You are free to stay or go as you please. The town is a 2-day walk east. There are other homesteads, but they are scattered." He left without another word. Alara watched from the doorway as he saddled one of the horses in the corral, tied an axe and a bag of tools to the saddle, and rode off, a solitary figure, disappearing into the vast landscape. Free to stay or go. The words echoed in her mind. Go where? Back to Perdition's End, where Silas and men like him prowled? She had no money, no connections, nothing but the borrowed dress on her back. To leave was to walk back into the nightmare. To stay was to place her trust in a man she barely knew, a man who had bought her like chattel, even if his intention seemed honorable. She spent the day exploring her small sanctuary. She tidied the cabin, a simple act of domesticity that felt strangely grounding. She found a small vegetable garden out back, overgrown with weeds but still bearing hardy squash and potatoes. She spent hours tending to it, her hands in the soil, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a lifetime. This was real. The sun on her back, the dirt under her nails, the ache in her muscles. It was a world away from the tear and helplessness. As the sun began to set, a familiar anxiety began to prick at her. She found herself watching the horizon, waiting for the sight of Jedediah's return. What if he didn't come back? What if this was all some elaborate, cruel game? Just as the shadows grew long and the air began to cool, she saw him, a distant speck cresting the rise. Relief washed over her, so potent it made her feel weak. She had not realized how much she had been counting on his return. She quickly went inside and, using the vegetables from the garden, began preparing a simple meal, adding what was left of the previous night's stew. When he walked through the door, weary from a day of hard labor, he stopped and looked at the table. He saw the bowls laid out, the fresh bread she had found in the larder and heated by the fire. He looked at her, standing by the stove, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. An unreadable emotion flickered in his eyes. He washed up and sat down. He took a bite of the stew, then another. "It's good," he said, his voice quiet. It was the first compliment, the first piece of praise she had received from anyone in so long it felt like a gift. After dinner, as he was cleaning his tools by the fire, she finally found the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her. "Jedediah," she began, her voice tentative. "Those men in the town, the one named Silas, will they come here?" He stopped his work, his hands becoming still. He stared into the fire, the orange light playing across his rugged features. He was silent for a long time. "Vile might," he finally said, his voice a low rumble. "Men like Silas see people as possessions. He thinks he was cheated of his prize even though I paid his price." "What will we do?" she whispered, the fear she had kept at bay all day returning with a vengeance. He turned his head and looked directly at her, his gaze unwavering and clear. There was no fear in his eyes, only a grim, resolute certainty. He had made a choice back in that stable, a choice to intervene, and now he was making another one. He would not just offer her sanctuary, he would defend it. "Let them come," he said, his voice as solid as the mountains at his back. He had made his choice, a decision that would bring danger to his door. As he closes that door, we hope you're enjoying this story of courage. If you are, taking a moment to like the video helps us bring more tales like this to you. Now, with the latch thrown, the real challenge began. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. Jedediah's declaration, "Let them come," had been a promise, not a threat, and with it a subtle shift occurred in the cabin's atmosphere. The unspoken fear was now a shared burden, and in sharing it, the house felt less like a temporary shelter and more like a fortress, however small. Ilara continued to bring the neglected parts of the homestead back to life. She revived the garden with a fierce determination, coaxing new life from the dry soil. She scrubbed the cabin until the wooden floors gleamed. She mended Jedediah's worn shirts, her stitches small and neat. Each task was an act of reclamation, a way of asserting her presence and her worth beyond that of a victim. She was no longer just a refugee, she was a contributor. Jedediah, in turn, began to open up, not with words, but with actions. One afternoon, he returned from the barn leading the gentler of his two horses. He had fashioned a makeshift side saddle from an old blanket and some leather straps. "You should learn to ride," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This is big country. A person needs to know how to cross it," he told her with a quiet patience she found surprising. His large, rough hands would guide hers on the reins, his touch sending a strange warmth through her. He showed her how to read the land, to find water, to distinguish the track of a deer from that of a coyote. He was sharing his world with her, the silent, beautiful kingdom that had been his only companion for so long. During these lessons, snippets of his past would emerge, brief and unadorned. He pointed to a small grove of aspen trees on a distant hill. "Mary, my wife, loved the way their leaves turned yellow in the fall," he said once, his voice distant. Another time, while fixing a water trough, he mentioned a small hand-carved toy boat he had once made for his daughter, lost to the fever that took her mother. Ilara listened to these fragments, understanding that each one was a precious, painful stone he was offering her from the well of his grief. She in turn began to share her own story. She spoke of a life back east, of a family that had fallen on hard times and sold her to a procurer to settle a gambling debt, a man who had then passed her along to Silas. She spoke of the long, terrifying journey west, stripped of her name and her dignity. As she spoke, she saw a muscle tighten in Jedediah's jaw. He did not offer empty platitudes or words of comfort. He simply listened, his silence a vessel for her pain, and in his eyes she saw deep, simmering anger on her behalf. One evening, they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast velvet sky. A comfortable silence had fallen between them, the kind that exists between two people who no longer need to fill the space with noise. "You've made this place feel different," Jedediah said, his voice a low murmur. "It was just a house for a long time. Now, it feels like a home again." Ilara's heart fluttered at his words. "I'm grateful for the safety you've given me, Jedediah." "It's more than safety I want for you, Ilara," he said, turning to look at her. In the pale moonlight, his eyes held a depth she had never seen before, an emotion that was equal parts protective and tender. Before she could respond, a sound cut through the night, the distinct, sharp bark of a coyote, followed by an unnatural reply. It was a signal. Jedediah was on his feet in an instant, his body tense. He scanned the darkness beyond the small circle of light from the cabin. "Get inside," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. "What is it?" she asked, her own fear rising. "Trouble," he said, grabbing the rifle that always rested by the door. "The kind we've been waiting for." The calm of the evening shattered. The air, moments before filled with the peaceful chirping of crickets, was now taut with menace. Jedediah moved with a lethal economy of motion. He handed Ilara an old, heavy pistol from a box on the mantel. "Do you know how to use this?" he asked, his voice a blade. She shook her head, her hands trembling as she took the weapon. "You pointed at whatever's not me and you pulled the trigger," he said, his instructions stark and simple. "Stay away from the window. Bar the door behind me." He didn't wait for a reply. He slipped out into the night, melting into the shadows as if he were born of them. Ilara scrambled to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She slid the thick wooden bar into place, the sound echoing in the silent cabin. The fortress had just been breached. She pressed her back against the door, the heavy pistol feeling like a block of ice in her hands. She could hear nothing but the frantic beating of her own heart and the crackle of the fire in the hearth. The silence outside was more terrifying than any noise. Where was he? How many were there? Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, a voice cut through the darkness, a greasy, familiar drawl that made her blood run cold. "Jedediah, we know you're in there, rancher, and we know you've got something that belongs to me." It was Silas. Another voice, rougher and crueler, laughed. "We saw the smoke from your chimney, saw the 2 plates on the line. You've been playing house." Ilara squeezed her eyes shut. They had been watching, the thought of their eyes on her, on them, during their quiet moments of peace felt like a violation. She heard Jedediah's voice then, calm and steady, coming from an unexpected direction somewhere near the barn. "You're on my land, Silas. Turn your horses around and ride out before you get hurt." "Hurt?" Silas's laugh was mocking. "There are 3 of us, old man, and 1 of you. We're not leaving without my property. Send the girl out, and we'll let you live out your lonely days in peace." "That's not going to happen." Jedediah's reply was flat, final. The standoff hung in the air, a breath held before the plunge. Then the night exploded. A gunshot rang out and the window of the cabin shattered, glass sprang across the floor. Ilara screamed, dropping to her knees and crawling behind the heavy wooden table. Another shot answered immediately, this one from the direction of the barn. Jedediah's rifle, its crack deeper, more authoritative. A man cried out in pain and surprise. "He's in the barn, get him," Silas roared. The night became a chaotic symphony of violence. Gunshots, shouts, the panicked whinny of horses. Ilara stayed huddled under the table, the pistol clutched in her white-knuckled grip. She felt utterly useless, a terrified child hiding from monsters in the dark. Jedediah was out there, alone, fighting for her, fighting for the home they had just begun to build. The sound of splintering wood came from the back of the cabin. One of them was trying to break in through the rear door. Panic seized her. This was it. Jedediah was occupied with the others. She was alone. Point it at whatever's not me and you pull the trigger. His words echoed in her mind. With a surge of adrenaline that was pure survival instinct, she rose from her hiding place. She crept toward the back wall, her eyes fixed on the rear door, which was now shuddering in its frame. She raised the pistol with both hands, the barrel shaking violently. The door burst open, and a large, bearded figure lunged into the room. He saw her and grinned, a predatory, broken-toothed snarl. He took a step toward her. Ilara didn't think, she just screamed, a primal sound of rage and terror, and pulled the trigger. The pistol bucked in her hands, the explosion deafening in the small space. The man stumbled backward, a look of pure shock on his face before crashing to the floor. Silence descended upon the cabin, thick and ringing. The smell of gunpowder was acrid in the air. Ilara stared at the still form on the floor, the heavy pistol hanging loosely in her hand. Her entire body trembled, a storm of shock and adrenaline. She had never fired a gun before. She had never taken a life. The man's surprised face was seared into her memory. The silence was broken by the sound of running footsteps outside, heading away from the cabin. A horse screamed, followed by the frantic drumming of hooves galloping into the night. They were retreating. The front door rattled. "Ilara, it's me. Open the door." Jedediah's voice. Scrambling on unsteady legs, she rushed to the door and fumbled with the bar, her hands shaking too much to get a grip. Finally, she managed to lift it. The door swung open, and Jedediah stumbled in. He was bleeding from a shallow gash on his forehead, and his shirt was torn, but he was alive. His eyes immediately went to the body on the floor, then to her, standing pale and trembling with the pistol in her hand. He crossed the room in 2 strides, taking the gun from her unresisting fingers and setting it on the table. Then he did something she never expected. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a fierce, protective embrace. He held her tightly as the tremors racked her body, his hand stroking her hair. "You're all right," he murmured into her ear, his voice rough with emotion. "You're safe. You did what you had to do." She buried her face in his chest, the solid feel of him, the scent of dust and gunpowder and pine grounding her. She clung to him, the horror of the last few minutes finally giving way to a flood of tears. He held her until the shaking subsided, his presence a shield against the nightmare. When she finally pulled back, he gently tilted her chin up, his thumb wiping a tear from her cheek. "You were brave, Ilara." "I was terrified," she whispered. "Bravery isn't the absence of fear," he said, his gaze intense. "It's acting in spite of it." He turned his attention to the dead man on the floor. His face hardened. "This is one of Silas's boys. The other one took a bullet in the leg. Silas? He got away clean. They won't be back tonight. But they'll be back." The reality of their situation settled back in. This was not the end. It was just the first battle. Silas was not a man to accept defeat. He had been publicly defied, and now 2 of his men had been shot on a quiet rancher's land. His pride and his authority were on the line. "What do we do now?" Ilara asked, her newfound courage already beginning to fray at the edges. Jedediah's jaw was set like iron. "We don't wait for them to choose the time and place again. Tomorrow, we ride into town. We go to the sheriff." Ilara's heart sank. "The sheriff? In Perdition's End? Can he be trusted?" Jedediah's expression was grim. "Sheriff Brody is a lazy man, not a corrupt one. He avoids trouble at all costs. But a dead body changes things. He can't ignore a killing. We're going to force his hand. We're going to end this, one way or another." He looked around the cabin, at the shattered window, the broken door, the blood on the floor. This place, their sanctuary, had been violated. The peace they had carefully built was shattered. Act 2 of their story was over. The bond had been forged in fire. Now the final act, the stand, was about to begin. The ride into Perdition's End was tense. Jedediah rode his strongest horse, with the body of the dead outlaw wrapped in a canvas tarp and slung over the back of the second. Ilara rode beside him on the gentle mare, the heavy pistol from the night before now tucked securely into a saddlebag. The world looked the same as it had on their first journey, the same rust-colored mesas, the same vast sky, but everything felt different. They were no longer a man and his rescued ward. They were partners riding into a fight. They entered the town's single dusty street, drawing immediate stares. The sight of Jedediah, his face a grim mask with a fresh cut on his forehead, leading a horse with a grim burden, was enough to stop all activity. Doors creaked open. Faces appeared in windows. Whispers followed them like a swarm of insects. Jedediah dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, a small, sad-looking building with a faded sign. He didn't wait for the lawman to come out. He untied the ropes and unceremoniously dumped the body onto the dusty boardwalk. It landed with a heavy, sickening thud. The door to the office flew open, and Sheriff Brody emerged. He was a man running to fat with a stained vest and a perpetually annoyed expression. He saw the body, then looked at Jedediah, his eyes wide. "Jedediah? What in God's name is this?" Brody blustered. "This is what happens when you let men like Silas run your town, Sheriff," Jedediah said, his voice cold and loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "He and 2 of his men attacked my ranch last night. They came for this woman." He gestured to Alara, who sat tall in her saddle, meeting the curious and hostile stares with a newfound resolve. "They fired on my home. This one broke in. He's dead, another is wounded, and Silas, the man who holds illegal auctions in your livery stable, ran like the coward he is." Every word was a hammer blow, an indictment delivered in the public square. Sheriff Brody's face turned from shocked to furious, a flush creeping up his thick neck. He was being challenged, his authority questioned in front of the whole town. "No, hold on, Jedediah," Brody stammered, trying to regain control. "There are 2 sides to every story. Silas is a businessman." "He's a slaver and a thief," Alara's voice rang out, clear and strong. The crowd murmured. This was the woman from the auction, the one the quiet rancher had paid a fortune for. She didn't look like property. She looked like a lady, albeit a tired and frightened one. "He held me in chains and sold me. Last night he came to take me back. Jedediah defended me. He defended his home." A figure pushed through the crowd. It was Silas. His face was a mask of cold fury. He was flanked by the 3rd man from the night before, who was leaning heavily on a crutch, his leg bandaged. "Lies," Silas spat. "This man stole my legal property. I went to retrieve what was mine, and he ambushed us. He's a murderer, Sheriff, and she's a runaway, a thief." The classic Western standoff ensued, not of guns but of narratives. On one side stood Jedediah and Alara, symbols of defiance and honor. On the other, Silas and his wounded crony, representing the town's ugly, corrupt underbelly. In the middle was Sheriff Brody, a weak man forced to make a choice. "This is a matter for the law to sort out," Brody declared, trying to sound authoritative. "Jedediah, you're under arrest for murder." Jedediah didn't even blink. "Are you also arresting Silas for kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder?" Brody hesitated. Arresting Silas would mean upsetting the delicate, rotten balance of power in Perdition's End. Arresting Jedediah was easier. "One thing at a time. You're coming with me." He reached for Jedediah's arm. In a movement too fast to follow, Jedediah stepped back, his hand dropping to the Colt revolver at his hip. Jedediah said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'm not spending a night in your cell while that snake is free to finish what he started. We came here to demand justice, Sheriff. If you won't provide it, we'll make our own." The threat was unmistakable. The crowd backed away, sensing the situation was about to explode. Sheriff Brody paled, his hand hovering near his own weapon. Silas smiled, a cruel, triumphant smirk. This was exactly what he wanted. The tension on the street was a physical thing, a coiled spring ready to snap. Sheriff Brody was sweating, his eyes darting between Jedediah's unwavering stare and Silas's smug grin. The town was watching, waiting to see which way the wind of justice or power would blow. "Now, Jedediah, don't be a fool," Brody pleaded, his voice losing its authoritative edge. "You can't threaten the law." "You're not the law," Jedediah countered, his voice cutting. "You're an excuse. You sit in that office and let scum like this fester in your town because it's easier than doing your job. That ends today." He turned his gaze to the crowd. "How many of you has Silas cheated? How many have had property stolen or been threatened into silence?" A few people shifted uncomfortably. A blacksmith near the front looked down at his boots. A woman who ran the general store quickly looked away. They all knew. They had all paid Silas's tithes of fear. "He's a liar," Silas roared, sensing he was losing the room. "He's a crazy old hermit who's lost his mind over a worthless runaway." Before Jedediah could respond, Elara urged her horse forward, positioning herself between him and the sheriff. Her eyes, clear and fierce, locked onto Silas. "I am not worthless," she said, her voice trembling but unbroken. "My name is Elara, and you stole my life. You treated me like an animal. But you were wrong. I am not property, and he is not a hermit. He is a good man. A better man than anyone in this town seems to be." Her words, spoken with such raw, dignified pain, struck a chord that Jedediah's threats and Silas's bluster could not. The blacksmith looked up, a flicker of shame in his eyes. The store owner's wife met Elara's gaze with a glimmer of sympathy. Jedediah saw the shift. He knew he couldn't win a gunfight against Silas and the sheriff, but he could win this. "I'm not asking for a war, Sheriff," Jedediah said, his tone shifting from confrontational to declarative. "I'm telling you how it's going to be. Elara is under my protection. We will be returning to my ranch. Anyone who follows us will be seen as a threat to our lives and our home, and we will defend ourselves accordingly. This is your one and only chance to do the right thing. Uphold the law. Arrest Silas for his crimes, or step aside and let honest folk handle their own affairs." He had drawn a line in the sand, not just for the sheriff, but for the entire town. He was claiming his own jurisdiction, based on a moral law that superseded Brody's tarnished badge. Brody was trapped. If he backed down, his authority was gone forever. If he forced a shootout, he'd be killing a man who, by all appearances, was defending his home and a wronged woman, and he would be doing it in defense of the town bully. He looked at Silas, at the naked greed and cruelty in the man's eyes. Then he looked at Jedediah, at the unshakable resolve. He looked at the body on his boardwalk. With a deep, defeated sigh, Sheriff Brody made his choice. It was the choice of a lazy man, the choice of self-preservation. "This is ranch business," he declared, his voice weak. "It's outside my jurisdiction." He turned and retreated into his office, closing the door behind him. He had officially washed his hands of the matter. A stunned silence fell over the street. Silas's face contorted in disbelief, then rage. He had lost. The law had abandoned him. "This ain't over, rancher," Silas hissed, his voice a venomous promise. "The law might be scared of you, but I'm not." "No," Jedediah said simply. He put his hand on Elara's horse's rein. "Let's go home." He turned his back on Silas, a calculated act of dismissal. He helped Elara guide her horse around, and together they began the slow, deliberate ride out of town, leaving the body, the silent crowd, and the smoldering rage of their enemy behind them. They had won the moral victory, but they both knew the real fight. The final, violent confrontation was still to come. Silas would not let this stand. He would come for them, and next time he would not be coming for a discussion. He would be coming for blood. The ride back to the ranch was heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. The victory in town felt hollow, a temporary reprieve before the final storm. They did not speak, but a new understanding flowed between them. They were no longer protector and protected, but partners in a shared fate. The ranch, visible in the distance, was no longer just Jedediah's refuge or Elara's sanctuary. It was their home, their defiant stand against the world's cruelty. When they arrived, the sun was low in the sky, casting the cabin in a warm, golden light that belied the coming darkness. They worked together, a seamless unit born of necessity and growing affection. Jedediah checked his supply of ammunition, his movements precise and grim. Elara filled every bucket and basin with water from the pump and barricaded the broken rear door with a heavy chest of drawers. They moved the horses into the sturdy barn, ensuring they would be safe from stray bullets. As Jedediah barred the large barn doors, Elara came to stand beside him. "We'll come tonight, won't he?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Jedediah nodded, his eyes scanning the darkening landscape. "He can't wait. He lost face in front of the whole town. His power comes from fear. If he lets us defy him and live, that fear dies. He has to crush us to remind everyone who's in charge." He looked at her, his face etched with concern in the fading light. "Elara, you don't have to stay for this. You could take the mare and ride north. You'd have a full night's head start." She met his gaze without flinching. The woman who had trembled in chains at the auction was gone. In her place was a woman forged in fire and resolve. You didn't leave me in that stable, Jedediah. I am not leaving you now. This is my fight too. This is our home. The word "our" hung in the air between them, a simple word that held a world of meaning. A ghost of a smile touched Jedediah's lips, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him. It transformed his face, chasing away some of the grief that lived in his eyes. "All right then," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "Our home." They returned to the cabin as dusk settled into night. They took up their positions. Jedediah stood by the front window, the one that wasn't shattered, his rifle resting on the sill. Ilara took the pistol and positioned herself by the side wall where she could cover the approach from the east. The cabin was dark, save for the low embers glowing in the hearth. They waited. The silence of the prairie night was absolute. Hours passed. The moon climbed high in the sky, bathing the valley in a pale, ethereal light. The waiting was a unique form of torture, a slow tightening of the nerves. Then, a flicker of movement by the creek bed. "They're here," Jedediah breathed, his body becoming perfectly still. "I see 4 of them." Ilara's heart began to pound, a frantic drum against the silence. 4 against 2. Silas had brought reinforcements. They didn't ride in shouting this time. They were smarter now. They crept forward on foot, using the rocks and the sparse trees for cover, dark shapes moving through the moonlight. This was not an intimidation tactic. This was an extermination. Jedediah raised his rifle. He waited, his breathing slow and even. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a man defending his entire world. He let them get closer, let their confidence grow. He waited until one of them, impatient, broke cover and made a dash for the relative safety of the woodpile. The rifle cracked, a single definitive explosion that shattered the night. The running man crumpled and did not move. The fight had begun. The immediate response to Jedediah's shot was a volley of gunfire that tore into the log walls of the cabin. Splinters flew and the air filled with the whine of ricocheting bullets. Ilara flattened herself against the floor, her heart in her throat. Silas and his men were no longer trying to intimidate. They were trying to kill. "Stay down," Jedediah commanded, already reloading his rifle with a calm, fluid motion. He peered through a small gap in the window frame, his eyes scanning the moonlit landscape. "They've split up. 2 are trying to flank us toward the barn." The tactical reality was grim. Jedediah couldn't cover both the front and the side of the cabin at once. "I see them," Ilara whispered, her eyes fixed on the shadows moving near the corral. They were using the fence for cover, inching closer to the cabin's blind side. Jedediah looked at her, a silent question in his eyes. She understood. He had to hold the front, where Silas and the 4th man were positioned. The flank was hers. She gave him a determined nod. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but her resolve was a fire that burned hotter. She crawled to the shattered window, keeping low to avoid the incoming shots. She could see the 2 men, their shapes dark against the silvered grass. They thought they were unseen. They were wrong. Resting the heavy pistol on the windowsill to steady her shaking hands, she took a deep breath, aimed for the center of the larger shadow, and pulled the trigger. The shot was wide, kicking up dirt a few feet to the man's left, but it had the desired effect. The 2 men dove for cover, their planned surprise attack ruined. They returned fire, forcing Ilara to duck back down, but their advance was halted. She had bought them precious time. From the front of the cabin, Jedediah's rifle cracked again. A cry of pain from the darkness told them he had found his mark. 2 down. "I'll come for the door now," Jedediah yelled, moving away from the window. "Get ready." He stood to the side of the main door, rifle primed. Silas, enraged and desperate, was done with tactics. A furious roar came from outside. "Jedediah, you're a dead man!" A heavy shape slammed against the door. Once, twice. The wood groaned, the bar holding but straining under the assault. Silas was trying to break it down with his shoulder. Jedediah looked at Ilara and pointed toward the hearth. "The fire poker," he mouthed. She understood instantly. She grabbed the long, heavy iron poker from its stand. As Jedediah stood ready with his rifle, she took her position on the other side of the door. The door shuddered again, and a crack appeared near the latch. It wouldn't hold much longer. With one final desperate roar, Silas threw his entire weight against it. The wooden bar splintered and snapped. The door flew open, and Silas stumbled into the room, his pistol raised, his face a mask of crazed fury. He was met not with one target, but two. Jedediah's rifle fired at the same instant Silas's pistol discharged. Jedediah grunted and staggered back, a red stain blossoming on his shoulder. Silas jerked violently as the rifle ball hit him square in the chest, but his momentum carried him forward. As Silas fell, Alara lunged, bringing the heavy iron poker down with all her might on the wrist of his gun hand. A sickening crack echoed in the room, and his pistol clattered to the floor. He collapsed in a heap, his eyes wide with shock and hatred, a final gurgling breath escaping his lips. Silence. The battle was over. Elar rushed to Jedediah's side. He was leaning against the wall, his face pale but his eyes clear. "It's just my shoulder," he gritted out, pressing a hand to the wound. "It's over, Elara. It's over." She looked around the room, at the broken door, the dead man at their feet, the smell of blood and smoke. It was a scene of brutal violence. But through the shattered window, she could see the first faint hint of dawn breaking over the mountains. A new day was coming. The dawn brought with it a profound, almost sacred quiet. The valley, which had been a theater of war, was now peaceful, the only sounds the gentle whisper of the wind and the distant call of a mourning dove. Elara, using strips torn from one of Mary's linen sheets, carefully bandaged Jedediah's shoulder. The bullet had gone clean through, a painful but not life-threatening wound. He bore the pain with his usual stoicism, but she could see the exhaustion etched on his face. Once he was tended to, they stepped out onto the porch. The world felt new, washed clean by the violence of the night. The bodies of the fallen men were stark reminders of the price they had paid for this peace. "We'll have to take them to town," Jedediah said, his voice weary. "Let the sheriff clean up his own mess this time." There was no victory in his tone, only a deep, somber finality. They had not sought this fight, but they had finished it. They had defended their home, their lives, and their right to exist in peace. They spent the morning in a shared, silent industry. Jedediah, moving stiffly, hitched the wagon while Elara prepared food and water for the journey. When the grim task of loading the bodies was done, they stood by the wagon, ready to leave. Jedediah turned to her, his good arm reaching out to gently touch her face. His gaze was full of a deep, quiet emotion that needed no words. "When we come back," he said, his voice a low, solemn promise, "we come back to start new. No more looking over our shoulders. No more ghosts." Elara leaned into his touch, her heart full. "I would like that, Jedediah." The journey to Perdition's End was a mirror of the one before, but this time, as they rode on to the main street with their grim cargo, the reaction was different. There was no hostility, no suspicion. There was awe, and in the eyes of many, there was respect. They left the bodies in front of Sheriff Brody's office, as before. This time the sheriff emerged, not with bluster, but with a weary resignation. He looked at the bodies, at Jedediah's bandaged shoulder, at the unyielding set of Alara's jaw, and he simply nodded. The town's reign of terror was over. Jedediah and Elara did not linger. They bought supplies, glass for the window, a new wooden plank for the door, and ointments for his wound. As they were leaving the general store, the blacksmith, the same man who had looked away in shame before, approached them. He held out a heavy, newly forged iron bar for their door. "On the house," he said, his voice gruff. "This town owes you both a debt." It was a small gesture, but it was everything. It was an acknowledgement, an apology, an acceptance. The ride home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was not the silence of uncertainty or fear, but the comfortable, easy silence of two people who had faced the worst together and survived. The sun was setting as they crested the final rise, the cabin below bathed in the warm, welcoming light of home. That night, after a shared meal, they sat on the porch, watching the stars reclaim the sky. Jedediah's arm, the good one, rested on the back of Elara's chair. "The bedroom?" Jedediah said softly. "It's not just your room, Elara. It's our room, if you'll have me." Tears welled in Elara's eyes, tears not of sorrow but of a profound and overwhelming joy. She had been bought at auction, a piece of property in a world of men, but in the heart of this quiet, lonely rancher she had found something priceless, a home, a partner, and a future she never dared to dream of. She turned to him, her hand covering his on the back of the chair. "Yes, Jedediah," she whispered. "I'll have you." In the quiet valley, Under the vast starry canvas of the West, two solitary souls, forged together in violence and bound by honor, finally found their peace. You've just witnessed a story of quiet strength and redemption. If this tale resonated with you, subscribe to our channel for more stories from the American West. Let us know your favorite moment in the comments below. Thank you for watching.